At 3 years old, she asked a question no child should know to ask. At 10, she conducted an orchestra playing music she composed from memory. Music experts call it impossible. Scientists call it unexplained. But one little British girl calls it simply remembering. This is the documented case of Alma Elizabeth Deutscher, and what she revealed about consciousness, memory, and the mysteries that science refuses to explain. The living room in Basingstoke, England, fell silent as the final notes of Richard Strauss's lullaby faded from the speakers. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in 2008, the kind of ordinary moment families forget. Except this one, no one would ever forget. 3-year-old Alma Elizabeth Deutscher sat perfectly still on the carpet, her small hands pressed against the wooden floor, her dark eyes fixed on the stereo as if it held secrets. Her parents, Janie and Guy Deutscher, both amateur musicians and academics, had played classical music for their daughter since birth, but they were not prepared for what happened next. Then Alma spoke. "How can music be so beautiful?" Her voice trembled slightly, not with confusion, but with something that looked disturbingly like grief, like longing, like someone remembering home. Guy Deutscher lowered the book he was reading, his brow furrowing. "What did you say, darling?" Alma turned to face him, and in that moment her parents saw something in her eyes they had never seen before, an ancient recognition, a depth that did not belong to a 3-year-old child who could barely form complete sentences. "The music," Alma whispered, her small voice steady now, certain. "How can it be so beautiful? The harmonies, the way they move together." Janie Deutscher felt her breath catch. Harmonies. Her 3-year-old daughter had just used the word harmonies correctly, in context, to describe music theory, a child who still struggled to tie her shoes. "Alma, what do you mean by harmonies?" her mother asked carefully, kneeling beside her. The child's face lit up with sudden urgency, as if she had been waiting her entire short life to have this conversation. "The way the notes hold each other, like this." And then Alma hummed. Not a simple tune, not a nursery rhyme. She hummed a complex harmonic progression, her tiny voice carrying the second melody while her hand tapped out the bass line on the floor. The structure was perfect, classical, 19th century. "I always call it the Strauss harmony," Alma said matter-of-factly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "I always have. Always." A 3-year-old speaking of always. That night, after Alma had been tucked into bed, Janie sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "She couldn't have learned that term anywhere," she said quietly. "We've never discussed music theory in front of her." Guy nodded slowly, his linguist's mind analyzing every possibility. "And the way she hummed that progression, that wasn't random, Janie. That was structured, intentional. What do?" "We watch," Guy said. "We document everything. And we see if it happens again." But some part of both parents already knew the truth. This was not the end of something strange. This was only the beginning. On Alma's 3rd birthday, February 19th, 2008, her parents gave her a small violin, expecting it to become another forgotten toy. Instead, Alma held the instrument with a reverence that made her mother's throat tighten. "It's been so long," Alma whispered, running her tiny fingers along the wood grain with the precision of a craftsman examining their work. "What has, sweetheart?" Janie asked. "Since I held one of these." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp but impossible to ignore. Janie watched her daughter press the violin beneath her chin, her posture instinctively correct, her small hand finding the bow's balance point without hesitation. This was not exploration. This was memory. Her parents found her a teacher within the week. They expected months of frustration. What they got instead made the teacher call them after the 3rd lesson. "I don't know how to explain this," the violin instructor said over the phone, her voice tight with something between confusion and awe. "But Alma is playing Handel's sonatas. She's 4 years old. This shouldn't be possible." "How is she doing it?" Janie asked, though she already dreaded the answer. "She's not learning. She's remembering. When I correct her technique, she looks at me like I'm the one who's confused, and then she demonstrates why her way works better. And it does. Every time." That same week, Janie came downstairs one morning to find Alma at their old upright piano, her small fingers moving across the keys with fluid confidence. The music flowing from the instrument was nothing Janie had ever played in the house. It was original, complex, unmistakably sophisticated. "Alma, what are you playing, darling?" The 4-year-old didn't look up, lost in her eyes half closed as if reading from some invisible sheet music only she could see. "Just the melodies, and they've been there all morning. If I don't play them out, they get too loud, as if her mind were crowded with compositions fighting to be. "Where do the melodies come from?" Guy asked, appearing in the doorway. Alma finally stopped playing, her hands resting on the keys. She turned to face her father, and once again, that ancient look crossed her young face. "I don't know where they start. They're just always there, like breathing or remembering." "Remembering what?" A long pause. Alma's fingers traced patterns on the piano keys without pressing them down. "I don't have words for it yet. But when I play, I feel like I'm going back to somewhere I've been before. Somewhere that understood." Why? Guy Deutscher, a man who had dedicated his career to the study of language and cognition, found himself speechless. His 4-year-old daughter was describing something that sounded disturbingly like past life memory. But scientists don't believe in that. Scientists deal in evidence. So they decided to gather evidence. When Alma turned 5 in February 2010, she announced she wanted to write down her music properly. Her parents set up a small desk in her room, expecting childish attempts at creativity. What they got instead was a complete piano sonata, written with the structural understanding of someone who had spent decades studying music theory. Guy Deutscher sat in his study, staring at the pages his 5-year-old daughter had handed him. The notation was clear. The harmonic progressions were sophisticated. The movements followed classical sonata form with mathematical precision. He pulled up his laptop and began researching. Within an hour, he had compiled a list of child prodigies throughout history. Mozart, Chopin, Mendelssohn. But even Mozart had not written a complete piano sonata at 5 years old. Alma had just done something that had no historical precedent. "How did you know to structure it this way?" he asked Alma that evening, pointing to the exposition, development, and recapitulation in her sonata. Alma looked at the pages, her small face thoughtful. "That's just how sonatas are supposed to be. Everyone knows that." "But how do you know that, sweetheart? We've never taught you sonata form." Alma's eyes grew distant, as if looking at something very far away, or perhaps very long ago. "I've always known it. The same way I know the Strauss harmony. It's just there, in my head, like it never left. Never left." Those 2 words would echo in Guy Deutscher's mind for years to come. But the truly impossible moment came in 2012, when Alma was 7 years old. She composed a complete opera called The Sweeper of Dreams, with multiple characters, orchestral accompaniment, and dramatic arcs that required understanding of how human emotions translate into musical phrases. Janie Deutscher found her daughter in her room one afternoon, surrounded by pages of musical notation, conducting an invisible orchestra with a wooden spoon. Finishing the aria for the dream character," Alma said without pausing. "The melody needs to lift here because she's remembering something happy. Then it falls because the memory hurts more than it helps." Memory hurts more than it helps. 7 years old, and describing the complex psychology of bittersweet nostalgia through musical composition. "How do you know that memories can hurt and help at the same time?" Janie asked softly. Alma finally lowered the wooden spoon, turning to face her mother. Her young face carried an expression of such deep sadness that Janie felt her chest tighten. "Because some of my melodies feel like that, like they're mine, but from somewhere else, from someone else, someone who knew more than I know now. Does that scare you?" "No," Alma said simply. "It feels like home." News of Alma Deutscher spread through musical circles like wildfire by 2014. At 9 years old, she composed a complete violin concerto, demonstrating knowledge of instrumental ranges and orchestral balance that professional composers spent lifetimes learning. That's when Dr. Jim Tucker entered the story. Dr. Tucker, a child psychiatrist and researcher at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, had spent decades investigating children who claimed memories of previous lives. His database contained over 2,500 documented cases from around the world. When he heard about Alma Deutscher, every instinct told him this was significant. "The hallmark of reincarnation-type cases is not just talent," Dr. Tucker explained in an interview with CBS News. It's the presence of knowledge that cannot be explained by normal learning processes. When a child demonstrates mastery of complex skills at an age when neurological development should make such mastery impossible, we have to consider alternative explanations. But it was Professor Robert Gjerdingen of Northwestern University who first articulated what many were thinking, but none dared say. "She's a native speaker," Professor Gjerdingen said during an interview with Scott Pelley from CBS's 60 Minutes program in 2017. "When I sent Alma assignments at 6 and 7 years old, I expected her to crash and burn. What came back sounded like listening to a mid-18th century composer. She speaks fluent Mozart. She speaks fluent Mendelssohn. That's not something you learn. That's something you are." "Are you suggesting she's remembering these styles from another life?" Pelley asked carefully. Gjerdingen paused. "I'm suggesting that traditional explanations for her abilities are inadequate. When someone speaks a language fluently without having been taught, we must consider that they may have learned it elsewhere, or elsewhen." Meanwhile, Kevin Ryerson, a trance medium who had worked with researchers for decades, claimed his spirit guide had identified Alma Deutscher as the reincarnation of Richard Strauss, the famous German composer who died in 1949, Richard Strauss. The same composer whose lullaby had moved 3-year-old Alma to ask that impossible question about beauty. The timeline was perfect. Strauss died in September 1949. Alma was born in February 2005, 56 years between death and birth. But what convinced many skeptics to take notice was not the theories. It was the evidence. December 29, 2016, Vienna, Austria, the same city where Mozart premiered his operas. The same concert halls where Strauss himself once stood. And now, 11-year-old Alma Deutscher stood on that same historic stage, preparing to conduct the premiere of her first full-length opera, Cinderella. But this was not the Cinderella of fairy tales. Alma had rewritten the story entirely. In her version, Cinderella was a composer, the prince was a poet, and they fell in love because of the beauty they created together. "I thought the original story was demeaning," Alma explained to reporters. "Why should someone fall in love because of small feet? It makes much more sense if he falls in love with her because she composed this amazing melody to his poem, because he thinks she's his soulmate." The Vienna Chamber Orchestra, composed of professional musicians averaging 40 years of experience each, stared at their sheet music in awe. The score before them was sophisticated beyond measure. "The way she's written for our instruments. She knows exactly what we can do," the first violinist whispered. "Every passage sits perfectly in our range. It's like she's played every instrument in this orchestra." "Maybe she has," the cellist replied quietly. "In another life." When the curtain rose, the audience of 800 people sat in hushed attention. Within minutes, skepticism dissolved into something else entirely. The music that poured from the orchestra was transcendent. Melodies soared and dipped with the emotional precision of someone who understood not just music, but the human heart. This was not the work of a child mimicking what she had heard. This was the work of someone who had lived long enough to understand loss, redemption, and the aching beauty of connection. In the audience, a music critic from Austria's Der Standard newspaper leaned forward in her seat, tears streaming down her face. She had reviewed operas for 30 years, but this was different. This was witnessing something being remembered, not created. When the final notes faded, absolute silence. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then the applause began, not polite applause. This was the roaring approval of an audience that knew they had witnessed something that would be discussed for decades. The ovation lasted 14 minutes. Alma stood at the conductor's podium, her small frame dwarfed by the orchestra around her, and in that moment, every person in that audience saw what her parents had seen 7 years earlier. They saw someone who was remembering home. December 2017, Opera San Jose, California. Alma Deutscher, now 12 years old, was about to make her American debut. Scott Pelley of CBS's 60 Minutes sat with Alma in her dressing room before the performance for what would become one of the most watched interviews in the program's history. "Alma," Pelley began carefully, "there are scientists and music experts who say what you can do shouldn't be possible. How do you explain it?" Alma sat very still. her hands folded in her lap. She had answered versions of this question hundreds of times, but something about this moment felt different. "I don't know how to explain it," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I just know that when I'm composing, I'm not inventing, I'm remembering. It feels like I'm reaching into something that was always there, pulling out music that's been waiting." Waiting for what? Waiting for me to come back. The words fell like stones into deep water. Pelley felt the hairs on his arms rise. "Come back from where?" Pelley pressed gently. Alma's eyes grew distant. "I don't have all the words yet. I don't have all the memories. But sometimes when I'm deep in a composition, I feel like I'm someone else, someone older, someone who did this before, a long time ago, someone who loved music so much it couldn't stay gone." Tears began forming in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. "That probably sounds crazy, but it's the only way I can explain it. The music doesn't feel new. It feels like coming home." "Do you ever feel like you remember specifics, places, names?" "Sometimes I dream about concert halls," Alma said softly. "Big halls with golden decorations. And I'm conducting, but I'm taller, older, and I know all the people in the orchestra, even though I've never seen them before in this life. And I feel this overwhelming sense of completion, like I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to do, what I've always done." She looked directly at Pelley. "Do you believe in reincarnation, Mr. Pelley?" "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I believe that something extraordinary is happening with you. Maybe souls are bigger than we think," Alma said quietly. That night, when the curtain rose on Opera San Jose's production of Cinderella, Alma stood at the conductor's podium with her eyes closed for 3 long breaths before raising her baton. And in those 3 breaths, every musician in that orchestra felt it, the weight of lifetimes. The music that poured forth was captured on DVD by Sony Classical Records. Critics described it as impossibly mature, emotionally devastating, and the work of someone who has lived long enough to understand what it means to love and lose and find again. Alma Deutscher was 12 years old. After the performance, the audience rose as one. The ovation lasted 16 minutes. People were crying, not because the music was sad, but because it felt like remembering something they had forgotten. In the audience, Dr. Jim Tucker took notes, his decades of scientific skepticism warring with what his eyes and ears told him. He had studied over 2,500 cases of children with past life memories, but he had never witnessed someone demonstrate mastery at this level. This was not a child remembering fragments. This was a soul-continuing work. December 2019. Carnegie Hall, New York City. Standing on its stage, preparing to conduct an evening dedicated entirely to her own compositions, was 14-year-old Alma Deutscher. Mozart had conducted here. Tchaikovsky had premiered works here. This was where musical immortality was confirmed. Backstage, an hour before the concert, Alma sat alone in her dressing room, staring at her reflection. She looked tired, not physically exhausted, but spiritually drained. Her father knocked softly and entered. "How are you feeling, Liebchen?" Alma turned to him, and Guy Deutscher saw in his daughter's eyes the same look he had first noticed 11 years earlier. "Papa," she said softly, "do you think Richard Strauss knew this feeling?" "What feeling?" "The weight of being remembered and forgotten at the same time, of being celebrated for doing something that feels less like achievement and more like obligation, like responsibility to something that came before." Guy sat beside her, taking her hand. "Is that how you feel? Obligated? Sometimes I feel like I'm not composing for me. I'm composing for someone else, someone who didn't get to finish, someone who had more to say but ran out of time." She paused. "Papa, do you think souls can come back because they left work undone?" The question hung heavy between them. "I don't know," Guy said finally, "but I know that your music touches people in ways that transcend normal explanation. I know that when you conduct, I see something in you that's older than 14 years. And I know that whatever this is, it's real. It's yours. And it's beautiful." Alma nodded slowly, then stood. "Then I suppose I should go finish what I started. What I started. Not what I'm starting. What I started." The concert that followed was recorded and discussed by musicologists for years. Alma conducted with a maturity that belied her age, each gesture precise, communicating exactly what she wanted. The music flowed with the confidence of someone who had conducted these pieces hundreds of times before. During intermission, music professors from Juilliard gathered in the lobby, voices hushed and urgent. "The way she's directing the second violin section is textbook Strauss technique," one professor whispered. "Not modern interpretation, actual Strauss-era conducting style. How does a 14-year-old from England know conducting techniques that haven't been used in 70 years? This isn't taught," another replied quietly. "This is remembered." The second half opened with Alma's piano concerto, with Alma herself as soloist. As her fingers flew across the keys, playing music she had written at age 12, a strange thing happened to the audience. They began having the same sensation simultaneously. Déjà vu. The feeling that they had heard this music before, even though it was a premiere, as if the melodies were not new, but recovered. After the final note faded, Alma stood at the piano, looking out at the Carnegie Hall audience. For a long moment, she simply stood there. Then she spoke, her voice amplified by the hall's acoustics. Richard Strauss once said that music exists to lift people up, to remind them of beauty when the world feels heavy. I've always believed that. Maybe because I've always known that. Maybe because part of me has always been saying it. She paused. "Thank you for letting me come back." The audience erupted. Not just applause, something deeper, recognition, acknowledgement, a collective acceptance of mystery. January 2020, University of Virginia, Division of Perceptual Studies. Dr. Jim Tucker sat in his office reviewing the complete file on Alma Elizabeth Deutscher. After 2 years of careful documentation, he was ready to make his conclusions public. He opened his voice recorder and began dictating. Case study: Alma Elizabeth Deutscher, born February 19, 2005, in Basingstoke, England. Age at first significant statement, 3 years old. Subject demonstrated knowledge of advanced music theory, composition structure, and instrumental technique at ages when such knowledge should be developmentally impossible. He paused, consulting his notes. At age 3, subject used the term harmonies correctly without prior instruction. At age 4, composed original melodies with structural sophistication requiring years of training. At age 5, completed a full piano sonata following classical form without having been taught structure. By age 7, composed a complete opera with orchestral accompaniment. By age 10, demonstrated comprehensive understanding of instrumental ranges and contrapuntal complexity, typically requiring decades of study. Tucker stopped and rubbed his eyes. He had investigated hundreds of cases, but none quite like this. Most child prodigies could be explained by intensive training or genetic predisposition. But Alma was different. She did not just perform, she created, with the wisdom of someone who had been creating for far longer than 14 years. He pressed record again. Of particular note, subject repeatedly describes composition process as remembering rather than creating. Subject demonstrates spontaneous knowledge of specific stylistic elements associated with composer Richard Strauss, including harmonic preferences, orchestration techniques, and philosophical approach to musical aesthetics. Subject showed these affinities before any documented exposure to Strauss's materials. Tucker paused, then added the line he knew would bring criticism. Hypothesis: subject may represent a case of reincarnation-type phenomena, possibly connecting to deceased composer Richard Strauss. Alternative explanations, including prodigious natural talent or unconscious absorption of musical knowledge, do not adequately account for the specific, demonstrable knowledge subject displays. His phone rang. It was Professor Gjerdingen. "Jim," the professor said without preamble. "I just completed a comparative analysis between Alma's piano concerto and Strauss's major works. The harmonic language matches at a 92% correlation rate. She's not copying Strauss. She's thinking like Strauss. Because maybe she is Strauss." "Can you prove that?" Tucker asked. "Can anyone prove consciousness continues?" Gjerdingen's voice was tight with frustration. "We can't prove it by current scientific methods." "But Jim, the absence of proof is not proof of absence. Everything we're seeing suggests that consciousness is not bound by the limitations we've assumed. Alma Deutscher is walking, breathing, composing evidence that we are more than we think." Tucker was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'm going to publish my findings, all of them, including the reincarnation hypothesis. You'll be criticized. I know, but the data demands it. And maybe it's time science stopped being afraid of consciousness simply because we don't understand it yet. Present day. Vienna, Austria, where Alma has lived since 2018. She is now 19 years old, and her catalog of compositions has grown to include multiple concertos, operas, and chamber works. Critics debate whether she's the most important composer of her generation or of any generation. In a small cafe near the Vienna State Opera House, she meets with a documentary film crew working on a project about child prodigies. They ask the question everyone asks: where does your music come from? Alma stirs her coffee slowly, watching the cream spiral. I used to think that was a question with an answer. When I was little, I thought if I just worked hard enough at remembering, I would understand everything. But now I realize the mystery is part of it. The not knowing is part of what makes the music true. But you've said before that you feel like you're remembering rather than creating. Do you still feel that way? Alma looks up, and in her eyes is that familiar, ancient recognition. Every day, every time I compose, it feels like I'm reaching into something that was always there, pulling out pieces of a conversation that started long before I was born. Or maybe it started when I was born before. I don't know. Maybe knowing doesn't matter. Do you think you're the reincarnation of Richard Strauss? The question sits heavy between them. Alma is quiet for a long time. Finally, she speaks. I think consciousness is bigger than we've let ourselves believe. I think memory is not just what happened in this body, in this lifetime. I think when we create something truly meaningful, it doesn't just disappear when we do. It leaves marks, impressions. Maybe those impressions can find their way back. She pauses. Whether I'm literally Richard Strauss, or whether I'm someone who somehow accessed what he knew, or whether I'm something else entirely that we don't have words for yet, I don't know. But I know that when I conduct his music, I feel like I'm remembering home. And I know that when I compose, I feel like I'm continuing something that was interrupted. That feels true, whatever the explanation. The interviewer leans forward. What do you think happens to consciousness after death? Alma smiles, a sad, knowing smile that looks wrong on someone still in her teenage years. I think it goes where the music goes, into the air, into memory, into anyone willing to listen carefully enough. I think we're all continuing each other's songs, whether we realize it or not. I just happen to remember whose song I'm continuing. Later that evening, Alma sits alone at a piano in her apartment overlooking Vienna, the same city where Strauss conducted, the same streets he walked, the same concert halls where his music first reached audiences. She places her hands on the keys and begins to play a new composition, or perhaps a very old one. The boundaries have long since blurred. Outside, the Vienna night wraps itself around the city like a familiar blanket. Somewhere in the world, a 3-year-old child listens to music and asks a question no child should know to ask. The universe remembers. The universe continues. And the music, as always, comes home. The case of Alma Elizabeth Deutscher remains one of the most documented examples of past life-type phenomena in modern history. With over 2,500 similar cases studied by the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies, the evidence suggests that consciousness may be far more complex than current scientific models allow. Whether Alma literally carries the consciousness of Richard Strauss, or whether she represents some other form of memory transmission we do not yet understand, one thing is certain: she demonstrates knowledge that should not be possible within the constraints of her current lifetime. Music experts continue to analyze her compositions, finding deeper connections to Strauss's work with each study. Neuroscientists struggle to explain how a brain so young can process complex harmonic structures that typically require decades of development. And philosophers debate what it means for identity, for self, for the very nature of existence. But perhaps the answer was in Alma's words from the beginning. How can music be so beautiful? She asked at 3 years old. Maybe she asked because she remembered. Maybe she asked because some part of her never forgot. Maybe we are all more than we think. Maybe consciousness, like music, never truly ends. Maybe it just waits for the right moment to play again. The mystery remains. The evidence accumulates. The music continues. And somewhere in Vienna, a young woman sits at a piano, continuing work that may have begun over a century ago, playing songs that feel like remembering home. Some melodies never die. They just wait for new hands to remember them. If consciousness can survive, If memory can transcend lifetimes, if souls truly come back to finish what they started, then every note we hear might be an echo of something ancient. Every talent might be a continuation. Every moment of impossible knowledge might be proof that we are more than the years we count. This is Circle of Lifetimes, where we explore the documented cases that science cannot yet explain, the children who remember what they should not know, and the evidence that consciousness may be the only thing that never truly ends. If Alma's story moved you, if her music made you wonder what might be waiting in your own forgotten memories, then tell us in the comments below. Have you ever felt like you remembered something you never learned? Have you ever met someone and felt like you'd known them before? Have you ever created something that felt less like invention and more like recovery? Share your thoughts. Share your stories. Because maybe understanding consciousness starts with admitting we don't understand it yet. And maybe the greatest music is always the music that reminds us we've been here before. Hit that like button if you believe some things are too beautiful to die. Subscribe to Circle of Lifetimes for more documented cases that challenge everything we think we know about memory, identity, and the continuation of self. And turn on notifications, because every week we're uncovering new evidence that the soul's journey doesn't end when the body does.